Welcome back to our sixth episode of the Year of the Bible. We return again to our discussion of the week's readings. As we said last week, we're getting into kind of some of the hard slog of reading through the entire Bible. The book of Numbers is called Numbers because there's a whole lot of counting in it. And that can sometimes get a little bit hard. But before we get there, we want to turn a little bit back to one of the readings at the very end of last week, Leviticus 23, and the assignment of the sacred times to come before God in worship. And as we do, I'm drawn back to one of our iconic hymns, "Come Ye Thankful People Come." We, in our tradition, usually sing this at Thanksgiving time as we think about Thanksgiving. And when we come to that time of year, we sing, "Come ye thankful people come, raise the song of harvest home. All is safely gathered in, ere the winter storms begin. God our Maker doth provide for our wants to be supplied. Come to God's own temple come, raise the song of harvest home." Every time we sing that hymn, I think to myself about what those words meant in years gone by, in even the 18th and 17th century. That notion of all is safely gathered in before the winter storms begin. These annual festivals of the ancient people around harvest and planting, I think were a reminder of that providence of God. In years gone by, before there were the grocery stores that we are so familiar with, and the refrigerators that are in everybody's kitchen, and the pantry with all of the canned vegetables, families needed to plan to eat. They believed they had enough, but didn't necessarily know. And survival was not a given. So this idea of coming before God at the beginning of the planting, at the beginning of the harvest, at the end of the harvest, was an acknowledgement that the very food that I eat is not guaranteed. It is not a foregone conclusion that I will always have a place I can go to buy food. I will always have enough to eat. And not just because I can or can't afford it, but it just may not even exist. Famines, when they came in the ancient world, hit everybody, from the king to the peasant. And it became difficult for people to live. And these times to appear before God again call us back to this notion of who we are in relationship to God. There's an author who says that worship is supposed to include an awareness of our standing in the overall rank of things.
Yeah. And like I said, and you see that and how what was important to them. It was almost like a Thanksgiving in some aspects, like what they didn't have and what they did have and what they were supposed to bring. And some of them brought grain offerings too, part of their responsibilities is bringing. And I thought about, as we're doing this and thinking about these sacred times, and I thought about what are sacred times for us, and like when do people really come before God? And in most cases, in our scenarios, at least in our churches, Christmas and Easter are like the big things that come along where you get large crowds of people. And then you think, and we were talking a little bit earlier in another meetings, like how come like Monday, Thursday, and Good Friday aren't more well attended? Because Good Friday, if it wasn't Good Friday, you wouldn't have an Easter. And you wonder why those ones, why that isn't a more of a sacred time to really think about why don't people really come to these services as a really sacred time to really remember, because he had to die first. That was the first requirement. Jesus had to die for our sins to be forgiven. He died to be raised later. And for granted, it's a joy to celebrate the resurrection. It's a joy to celebrate his birth. I just often wondered why those holidays and like others, even like Pentecost for me is like a great one. Like, because it's the birth of the church, like we say. It's a time to celebrate that we were called to the the languages got to go and to be spread, and the church began to be born, and but yet there's not a whole lot of celebration in those times. It's like it seems like our big two, like they have three, and we would think we have two. Mostly were Christmas and Easter.
One of the questions to be asked is when we do have Christmas and Easter, which are absolutely the
Yes.
central, the whole of our Christian year is organized around those two festivals. Are they acknowledgments of dependence? Because the ancient festivals were acknowledgments
Yes.
of dependence.
Yes.
That it was an acknowledgement that if God doesn't act, I just may not make it to next year. Which is the undergirding of Christmas and Easter. If God had not acted on our behalf, then where would we be?
Yes.
The question is, do we live in that dependence or do we perhaps take it for granted?
Yes.
Well, as we move into the ending of Leviticus, we get into this idea of Sabbaths and the Jubilee year. One of the ongoing debates in biblical scholarship is whether or not the people of Israel ever kept either of these, whether or not they did have this Sabbath year once every 7 years where they didn't plant and they lived off of the produce of the land. Certainly we can see in there the importance of what has become crop rotation and letting land lay fallow for a period of time. At the same time, however, there is this notion of dependence and trust. And if I'm going to just let the land produce, there's a chance that I may not have as much. And then once every 50 years comes the Jubilee celebration where debts are forgiven and people are returned to their land and slaves go free and the celebration comes. If the people ever celebrated the Jubilee, they didn't do it for long and they didn't do it, they gave it up, and in part, the giving it up was part of the judgment that fell on the ancient people. This kind of Jubilee experience would bring us back to a place of equity. Over time, wealth tends to shift and collect together in certain folks. And if once every 50 years we resettle that and brought everybody back, it would be hard to have the vast inequality that can be seen in our world these days.
And I think, when you think about this, it's just how that Jubilee year, that 50th year, when you just see the celebrations of freedoms that people did, and to be able to say, whatever debt you had to that person, it was free. You were no longer held responsible for this. To think about all that and how that was a big celebration, but also to have that reliance that even in the other times, it was almost like as they were going through, you planted so much and then you didn't do anything on that, or you ate for 6 days and you didn't eat on the seventh. You gathered enough for those six. So this was a routine they were used to. Just it's different now because it's in years instead of days or whatever the situation. But it's not something that's new to them, but it's something that they have to follow. And I think that part of this thing is like when you have these times and you're going through them, and every 7 years you're not supposed to you're rotating things, you're doing things, you're not planning things up there, you're relying that God's going to provide for those times. And like you said, whether or not or how long we did this, it's hard to know, but just to think about
We certainly aren't doing it. We certainly are doing it now.
That's for sure.
And at the risk of at the risk of being called naive in the workings of large economics, I think it's important for us to wonder about that. We tend to say as we pray the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Our Presbyterian brothers and sisters say, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And there is evidence in the ancient manuscripts that A, that's probably the word, and B, that it did have an economic meaning. Our faith should have economic meaning. It should impact where we shop and what we buy and who we lend money to and who we borrow money from and where we invest. If we separate money out from faith, then we cut ourselves off. There's an old evangelist saying that Jesus will be Lord of all, or he will not be Lord at all. And if Jesus is not Lord even in our finances and our economics, then is he actually the Lord of our lives?
Right. Well, I don't remember what it was through. It may have been through doing stewardship things. What I often say is, when you look in your checkbook, you can see what you obey the most or what you give the most to or what you value. And because when you're looking at what you're actually writing things for compared to maybe what you're giving to God, you can see what is of more value in the circumstances of what they're doing. And there's a lot in that sense, because I've often remembered, it's like, wow, I never thought of that. But then when you think about it and you actually see what is there, you begin to process, wow, yeah, this is, I see where I've put more things above God than I should have, or whatever the situation is. But yes, just going through that time and seeing this time through the obedience and trust that they had to believe that God provides. And I think in aspects has to be our own belief and obedience too, that as we give and we do things, as we don't do obviously the year of Jubilee, but we're still required to make offerings and do things that we go, that when we do, that God is going to take care of us. He's going to provide for us if we're obedient to him. And in believing that and trusting in that, knowing that he's there, because they had to believe that, if they weren't going to plant for that seventh year, they were going to have to believe that they had enough in those 6 years that they had that was going to hold them over. And this believing in that sense that God will be with us as well in our timings.
Well, we move into Numbers, and as I said, a lot of counting, a lot of genealogies, the begats, as sometimes they're described, from the King James. And I think that some of the counting calls us to remember that people matter, that this faith of ours is about real people. Each one of these names was an actual person, and each of them lived a life. They They planted, they harvested, they had children, they didn't have children, they, they got married, they celebrated, they suffered. And it's sometimes easy, I think, for us to lose sight of this notion that God is in the business of walking with people through life.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think this is what we have to remember as well, that through our scenarios, whatever it is we're going through, that he's there, he's walking through us, no matter what, whether it's personal lives, whether it's what's going on in our churches, whether it's what we're doing, that God is not one to sit still, but he's moving, and he's moving with us, and he's there with us, and he's not just saying, oh, well, you're doing this, I'll see you, I'll go let you take care of this by yourself. He's not like that. He's the one that's there to help us to get through these times when we put our trust into him in these scenarios. And like you said, just having these people and reading and realize that each one of these people had a role in some form or fashion. They had a responsibility throughout these lives, and you see that as we continue to move on. Like, one of the things that really stuck out to me is in chapter 7, it was like each one of these people were required to make a dedication to the thing, and each one they did not leave anybody out. Each one listed exactly the name and what they brought. I mean, it was the gifts that they were bringing to help support this tabernacle, this dwelling, that each one of them brought something to do that. And that was just like something that just, I was like, wow, this is so special that these people this is what they did. They were important. But they brought something so that it could be dedicated. It was just a beautiful thing to see.
I was struck before that in chapter 5. There's this whole litany of laws in regards to men and women. One of the things that struck me was the protection that is in there for women. The general sense of the ancient world is that women were of no value. Even within the scriptures, men couldn't commit adultery. Only women committed adultery. Yet, in Numbers chapter 5, women are given the agency to be able to defend their own honor. Yeah. And I think that's just an amazing, amazing thought that our ancient ancestors included, and that God made sure that they included an opportunity for a woman to have some agency. Yes. Not nearly what a man did, perhaps, but some.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's probably one of those things, especially like it says in 19 there, that the priest would make her swear a solemn pledge that if she had not did it, that then it wouldn't defile anything about what they done. So just to have that opportunity, like you said, to be able to defend, or if you want to defend yourself, is a big thing that a lot didn't have at that time, because they would just believe they didn't have the rights, so to speak, to do that like they do now.
The readings for this week also include a refrain of one standard for the citizen and the stranger alike. And I think it again speaks to this notion. The ancient world, and even the modern world to a certain extent, can have a sense of insiders and outsiders. And the scriptures call us to notice the outsider and to care for the outside, to make sure that no one is just thought nothing of. Because again, people matter.
Yeah, absolutely. It goes from that aspect, and it goes into the Nazarite beliefs and things, and how they're not supposed to drink what says, my version says wine vinegar or brandy vinegar or any kind of grape juice or anything like that. Just things like anything produced from the grapevine. It says they're not supposed to do. And I believe, isn't it? It's the Nazarene. They're not supposed to cut their hair. Even in the sense it says, while Nazarene, the person is holy to the Lord. If someone suddenly dies, they can become. And it was the same thing. It was like they had rules, but they also had things. They had purification rites. There wasn't a whole lot much difference, except they throw it in here as well to make sure that the Nazarenes are taking the promise and the understanding that these instructions go to them as well, in a sense.
So I do want to talk a little, if we can, about the idea of these Nazarites or Nazarenes, as you say. One of the things to be sure that folks understand is that this Nazarene or Nazarite is different than when we say Jesus of Nazareth. They sound very much alike, but it is a different thing. When we say Jesus of Nazareth, we are not connecting Jesus with these people who make vows. These are folks, and yes, only men could be Nazarites. But they were men that made vows. Some of them were for a period of time. Some of them were for a lifetime. Yeah. Samson, very famously, was dedicated to be a Nazarite for his entire life. But there were others that would make a vow for a particular period of time. I think of, both you and I are sports fans, and I think of the athletes, usually in sports like baseball and hockey, where the athletes will say, "Okay, I won't shave until my team loses in the playoffs or something," and that's what we're talking about now. Granted, hopefully everybody that made a Nazarite vow was about something more important than the Steelers winning the Super Bowl, though it appears, at least for Pastor Dan and I, we may have beards that we trip on before we get another Super Bowl win. But that's a different topic. It was more along the lines of a young man who said, "I want to get married, and I will dedicate myself as a vow until a wife is found and I can be married." And so for that period of time, they took on all of these behaviors, or until rain falls for my crops, or just different specific things.
Yes.
And they would, as you say, they would commit themselves not to shave, not to cut their hair, not to drink. And want to, if I can, pause here for just a minute and talk a little bit about wine in the ancient world. It wasn't as pure as the wine that you and I find in the grocery store. Wine kind of varied, and it was thick and it was nasty, and the ancients would put water in it, and it was what they had at hand. But a Nazarite would not drink the wine. They would not do a number of other things as they lived into their vows.
Right. And then we talked a little bit about the dedication that these leaders had to their tabernacle, bringing gifts, and what that meant to them, of how they got into these things, and each one had somebody from their tribe, so to speak, that would bring a gift, and as you're reading this, you can see what they have, and each one was something different, that it was a dedication that they were giving to that. And you had the dedication of not only these gifts. When you get into chapter 8, you see dedication of the Levites. And if you remember, the Levites now are the priest of this. They run in here, so they have important responsibilities that they do here. and they're the ones now, along with Aaron and his sons, that are the ones who can accept the sacrifice, can accept these things, that they do these things. And but the one thing that really stuck out to me here, we were joking a little bit as Pastor Tom said he'd already be done. But one of the things says the rule applies to the Levites, that everyone 25 years and above will enter into service, performing the duties for the meeting tent. At 50 years old, they would retire from service. I was like, well, I'm over 50. You're over 50.
I am over 50.
I was like, well, it would be nice, but I'm not retiring anytime soon. So
Nor am I. Nor am I.
But
And I think, again, we tend to think that, well, 50 was a lot older in
Yes,
in those
in their
days
time.
than it is now. And in some ways it was. I mean, life was harder. And so 50 years was hard on the body. And people did live a long time. When we talk about the life expectancy of the ancient world being so much less than of the modern world, that's not to say people didn't live long lives. It is instead to say that altogether too many people died young.
Yeah.
Not that being a priest was all that particularly dangerous. One of the things that really stuck out to me in that portion of Numbers is, as you say, the allowance that is made. In chapter 9, it talks about if somebody has come in contact with a corpse, so then they can't keep the Passover. The scriptures say, well, okay, you can do it next month. Just delay it a month. Do the same thing in the next month. And I think it's important to see that God makes allowance for when life happens.
yes,
If a Nazirite happens to come in contact with a corpse, because in the ancient world that could happen. It's not, it doesn't happen for us, but things can happen.
Yep.
And if you happen to, well, then shave your head,
gotta do.
start over again,
Yep.
and you start the vow again. Allowance is made for life to happen.
Yes.
Well, we move eventually into one of the more iconic stories in the book of Numbers, the spies that are sent into the land in chapters 13 and 14. Most folks that have gone through Vacation Bible School remember the story of the 12 spies go up into the land, and they bring back a bunch of grapes that is so large it takes two people to carry it. I don't know if when you were in Israel, but I remember when we traveled to Israel, seeing the number of carvings that had two people carrying a stick with one bunch of grapes, intended to show the fertility of the promised land. They saw the fertility, but they also found out that there were people that lived there, and the folks that lived there thought they wanted to stay. The spies came back and said we were like grasshoppers in their eyes. They're these giants. There's no way we can take them on. Joshua and Caleb come back to say, wait, we're the giants. They're the grasshoppers. We can do this. But the people choose to go with the 10 who are afraid.
Yep.
I had a professor in seminary who used to say there were only two times in Scripture that we took an actual vote and let the majority rule. Both times we got it wrong. This was one, and the other was when we let the crowds vote on whether to save Jesus or Barabbas. And both times we chose wrong. But eventually the people will go into the land.
Yes.
We come across the judgment that God bears,
Oh,
that
yes.
because of that, none of that generation will enter.
Nope.
Even Moses doesn't enter into the promised land. As you jump over into chapter 20, we see the reason for that. The people grumbled. I do have to say, if there was any one refrain that just repeats more than any other through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, it is that phrase, and the people grumbled against Moses. They mumbled against Moses. Couldn't we be back in Egypt? Wouldn't it be better if we were in Egypt? Let's go back to Egypt. Fortunately, that no longer happens. People no longer grumble about all of the various things going on around us. But nonetheless, so they were grumbling against Moses, wanted some water. God says to Moses, strike that rock over there and some water will come out. And the key thing is that Moses said in verse 10 and 11, listen, you rebels, shall we get water for you out of this rock? Not God will get water for you out of this rock, but shall we? Shall I get you some water? And he strikes the rock. And not only does he strike it, he strikes it twice. It is that anger, it is that presumption, shall I get water for you, that precludes Moses from going into the land.
It's almost like he's doing it because him and Aaron are there. It's almost like he's hitting it because of the two of them.
Right. Once for you, once for me.
Yes, not because of what God instructed him to do, but taking the responsibility. Or when he knows himself, that's not, it was God who provided. But in fact, even in mine, it says, first it says, in right before that in chapter 8, or in verse 8, it says, you and Aaron, your brother, take the staff and assemble the community in their presence. Tell the rock to provide water. Tell the rock to provide water. Just talk to it. You will do it. You will do it. And then it says, when you will produce water from the rock for them and allow the community. And then, but like you said, again, he's using that we. It's not this, it's almost like he's so tired of the people complaining. It's just like, maybe if we take credit, they'll stop complaining, even though he knew that wasn't the case. But it was like the people have been complaining. That God has already said what's going to happen to them. He's been punishing. He's been doing different things up to this time, not withholding judgment, and it doesn't do good for the people. They continue to complain as they're going through the wilderness. It's a hard piece. They're still learning through this time of what it's like to live outside of slavery, so to speak, and having stuff given to them. And here now they have to work for it. And where before it was like they were working, but they were receiving. And now they have to do everything on their own or help to do things. And it's different for them when you look through their eyes, what they're now having to do, what they didn't have to do for like 400 and some years, however many it was, 430 or 450, when they were in captivity, never had to do, they had to work, yes, but they were always given food or drinks or whatever. And now they're out in this wilderness wandering around, and they just continually complain. It's like, and even sometimes say, but we wish we would have stayed in here because you're going to make us die out here.
Right.
And even Moses uses that sometimes in God's things. Like, well, if you do this now, like people back there go like, well, you just brought them out here to kill them. And then that's going to make you look back as a God. And so he withholds things. But
yeah, I think about,
crazy.
I think about the manna and the grumbling, in the story, the people grumble, there's nothing to eat. And so God promises manna. And every morning there is edible bread on the ground, and they eat it. And amazingly, watching this literal miracle day after day, eventually they even start grumbling about that.
Yep.
Couldn't we have a different flavor? Couldn't we have something besides?
Yep.
It's so hard for us to live in that continual dependence, to trust in God and receive what is at God's hand, and not grumble,
Right.
not complain, about whatever it is.
Yep.
I think of I think it's Joni Mitchell who back 50 years ago said, Lord, won't you give me a Mercedes Benz? My friend has a BMW and I must make amends. I mean, there's always grumbling about something else, always something else, rather than receiving the mercy that is at hand and holding on and trusting in God.
Yes.
Well, that's a good word for us to end with this week. And we will continue as we move through Numbers and into Deuteronomy next week and continue this journey into the Promised Land. Thank you for joining us. Hope that you will like us on Facebook and share the link with your friends and neighbors and continue reading as we continue this year of the Bible.